Okay, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Porkins' Great Game. As always, I am your co-host, Pierce Redmond, and you can find this podcast and every other podcast that I do by going to porkinspolicyreview.com. And as always, joining us from Germany is our good friend, Christoph German. So, Christoph, how are you?
Hi, Pierce. Thanks. I'm doing fine. There have been a lot of interesting stories recently in Central Asia and the Caucasus region. I think we have enough to talk about this episode.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think this episode is going to be a little bit longer, and it's definitely going to be jam-packed with a lot of information. As Christoph said, the past couple of months and weeks have been pretty insane in the region. So maybe we'll get right into it, and we'll start with our good friend Mikhail Saakashvili, who continues to impress me and Christoph with his insane behavior. But just recently, towards the end of May, we had Saakashvili popping up, and this time it wasn't because he had said something insane. This was because of the insane actions from the Ukrainian government. And this time it was the good old NATO Western puppet Petro Poroshenko, who personally appointed Mikhail Saakashvili, the ex-president of Georgia, to be the governor of Odessa. Now, the Odessa Oblast is a huge region. It's very important economically for Ukraine. It's a port city. It's also been virtually untouched by the war going on in the east of the country. Now, Saakashvili was, recently Poroshenko's advisor on reform, if you can imagine that, this, criminal warmonger. And he had sort of been floating around in Ukraine, particularly in Kyiv. Wasn't really sure what was going to be going on with him. He was this sort of informal advisor, as I said, on reform. And Saakashvili was repeatedly denying rumors that were circulating in the press that he would be taking any kind of official position within the Ukrainian government. And most recently, just a few weeks ago, he reiterated that no, I'm never going to join. I'm a Georgian citizen. Blah blah blah. Now, as I said at the end of May, Poroshenko granted Saakashvili citizenship, and Saakashvili suddenly, forgot all about this and renounced his Georgian citizenship, accepting this position to much fanfare. He actually told the BBC that a Georgian passport meant, quote, guaranteed imprisonment. And he also made some other really bizarre claims, including that Odessa was a front line against not only local corruption, but Russia itself. And perhaps the most bizarre thing that he said to the BBC was, quote, if Odessa ever falls, God forbid, then Georgia might be wiped out from the map. So pretty intense language. But Christoph, you want to fill us in on anything else specifically about Saakashvili's appointment in Odessa, and then we'll get into some other details in a moment.
Yes, but what you pointed out there is very important. It's a sudden change of mind. He has always rejected taking an official post in the Ukrainian government, and he was only Poroshenko's advisor for a while. He had, for example, been offered to take the post of deputy prime minister, and he said that he wants to return to Georgia eventually to, quote-unquote, save the country. So he can't give up his Georgian citizenship, and taking a post in the Ukrainian government would mean he would have to get Ukrainian citizenship and would automatically lose Georgian citizenship. So therefore it was even more surprising when he was then appointed by Poroshenko at the end of May as governor of Odessa. And suddenly he was happy to give up his citizenship and gave this interesting interview to the BBC where he explained it and said that Georgian passport means guaranteed imprisonment for him. But that has been clear for quite a while, and there's no indication whatsoever that this could change in the foreseeable future. Saakashvili is an idiot, but he's not that stupid to only realize now that a return to Georgia is highly unlikely. So his change of mind raised a few questions. What did change in these couple of weeks? Well, the situation around Transnistria changed, and Transnistria is, of course, right across the border from Ukraine's Odessa region. And that doesn't strike me as a coincidence.
No, not at all. You were writing in a recent New Great Game Roundup sort of speculating that perhaps Washington had asked Saakashvili to sort of, accept this position. And as you said, I mean, he, a complete about face. Before we get into Transnistria, which we're going to get into some detail, it is interesting, this whole issue of Saakashvili's citizenship, because as far as I understand, technically speaking, he's still a Georgian citizen because he hasn't formally renounced it with the Georgian Ministry of Justice.
Right,
And in fact,
the Georgian government can renounce it. They can
yes.
procedures at any time now. So it's not
right, exactly.
in his hands anymore.
Yeah, no, it's not. And of course, his allies still in Georgia are a little uneasy about this because they sort of want him to remain a Georgian citizen, because if he's not, then he's no longer technically the leader of the national movement, which is his political party. So some interesting sort of stuff going on there. But Christoph, you just mentioned Transnistria, and I'm sure that this is a region that very few people who are studying this sort of this landscape may be aware of. This is a tiny little strip of land that broke away from Moldova. It is situated, between Moldova on the west and Ukraine on the east. They are basically only exist due to Russian support. They are a pro-Russian breakaway state, as I mentioned. It's a very bizarre little, country, I guess you could say. It sort of harkens back to this age-old time where the Soviet Union was much bigger and more popular. Their flag still has a hammer and sickle. There are statues of Lenin and Marx littered all over the city, in the capital. So it's a very bizarre little area, but as I said, it has been sort of a point of contention between the West and Russia. Now, what makes this so interesting, again, is that Russia has about 1,500 troops that are stationed in Transnistria. Most of them are peacekeepers, and then the rest of them are actually Russian troops that are just, sort of there as a sort of contingent force. Now, in the past couple of weeks and months, there has been some very interesting developments going on within Transnistria. We had on May 25th, Kommersant reported that Moldova was quietly arresting and deporting Russian troops that were entering into Transnistria from Moldova. There is no actual airport within Transnistria for Russian troops to land in, so they actually have to fly to Moldova, where they're obviously not, greeted very warmly, and then cross into Transnistria. And on top of that, Ukraine has sort of finally canceled all sort of military relationships with Russia, and up until very recently, Ukraine was allowing for Russian troops to go in to Transnistria from the Odessa Oblast. So that is no longer in play as well. Now, Christoph, we've talked many times before about proxy wars and things like that. We've mentioned places like Nagorno-Karabakh, which is obviously some sort of a proxy war going on with Azerbaijan and Armenia. Obviously, Azerbaijan being backed by NATO and Armenia to a degree being backed by Russia. But it actually seems as if what's going on in Transnistria could really turn into an actual real proxy war with people dying on either side. And again, it seems very odd that of all the people they would appoint, they would pick Saakashvili, who obviously has no qualms about attacking Russia or getting involved in some sort of conflict with Russia. So, Christoph, you want to kind of broaden this out a little bit, because as I said, it's odd that they would pick Saakashvili to be governor, but they've also, for good measure, thrown in a couple other Saakashvili cronies, including the former Justice Minister, Zarub Adishvili, who will reportedly be the chief prosecutor of Odessa. He's also currently wanted by Georgian authorities. But we also have the former Georgian Interior Minister, Gia Lord-Pedansky. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. And he will be the head of the regional police in Odessa. And I believe we've actually mentioned him maybe once before on the podcast. But Christoph, do you want to kind of broaden that out a little bit and explain why Saakashvili's appointment is not only big in the sense that, this is they're reviving him yet again, but in the context of what could be going on in Transnistria in the very near future.
Yes, one important point you mentioned there is that Russia's 14th Army has been stationed in Tiraspol, which is the capital of Transnistria, since the 1980s. And the Russian army continues to deter Moldova from conquering the territory. And Russia long used two different routes to supply and rotate its forces in Transnistria. One overland route through Ukraine and airlifts to the Moldovan capital Chisinau. But the Ukrainian route has been closed for more than a year due to the conflict in Ukraine. And at the beginning of this month, Ukraine formalized its withdrawal from the agreement with Russia that allowed the use of this land route. And to make matters worse, Russian media revealed at the end of May that Moldova has been arresting and deporting some Russian soldiers who try to travel to Transnistria via Chisinau. And furthermore, the authorities in Transnistria have been sounding the alarm over the massing of Ukrainian soldiers on the border. And amidst all of this, Saakashvili is appointed as governor of the Odessa region. And one of his first actions is to announce that he will reinforce the border with Transnistria. And the icing on the cake is, of course, Ukraine's deployment of S-300 air defense missile systems on the border with Transnistria. And if Moldova completely shuts down Russian transit to Transnistria, things will get very interesting and very dangerous. Because, as you mentioned, at the moment, Transnistria has no usable airports, but Russia is apparently planning to reopen the long-abandoned airport in Tiraspol. The problem is that the most direct route takes Russian airplanes through Ukrainian airspace over Odessa. A longer route would go through Romanian and Moldovan airspace. And therefore, the S-300 deployment is very significant. Even the guys from Stratfor felt the need to point out that it looks as if Ukraine is preparing to shoot down Russian planes, which would be completely crazy. But I wouldn't put it past the freaks in Kiev and Odessa's new governor to do something like that. And therefore, Saakashvili's appointment is very, very significant. And it's, of course, interesting that he's bringing in his old crew. As you mentioned, there have been some reports that his justice minister will join him, who's wanted in Georgia, but this hasn't been confirmed so far. But his former deputy interior minister, Lord Kipanidze, is already in Odessa. He was presented, I think, yesterday. And as Georgian media was quick to point out, this guy has a few skeletons in his closet. He was responsible for the recruitment and training of Chechens living in exile in Europe. They were brought to Georgia, trained, and then sent to Russia to join the North Caucasus insurgency. And the whole scheme was exposed after a shootout between Chechens and Georgian security forces in the Caucasus Gorge of Lopota in 2012, which became known as the Lopota incident. And an investigation by Georgia's public defender later revealed the details of the terrorist recruitment and training scheme and revealed that it was coordinated by Lord Kipanidze, who is now the new head of the police in Odessa. So he's definitely the right man at the right place at the right time.
Absolutely. And again, I mean, it's difficult in geopolitics sometimes to speculate about, potential trouble zones or things of that nature. But again, let's reiterate this, of all of the people to put in Odessa, which again, as I said, is a major economic hub. This is also, Odessa is home to the Ukrainian mafia. It is a major transshipment point for heroin bound to Europe and elsewhere. To put one of the most corrupt, Georgian leaders in recent years in there, and someone who is not shy about confronting Russia, this is a pretty big step. And just recently, NATO officials were in Moldova to, I guess, show support. On the other side of Moldova, we have Romania, which is a complete NATO colony at this point. So it does seem as if things are starting to heat up. And as you said, I mean, they're placing these anti-aircraft missiles, even if they never use them, even if this is just
even
a
if they
threat.
don't use the S-300. But when you have guys like Lord Kipanidze, who are famous for organizing anti-terror operations against Russia, it's also very likely that they could stage some sort of false flag, some kind of provocations on the border of Transnistria and try to provoke Russia into a military intervention.
Mm.
It's
Oh,
looking very
absolutely.
likely at this moment.
Oh yeah, I mean, really, all they seriously need is, to just organize a couple of Ukrainian troops that fire into Transnistria. Then we have Russians, firing back, and then suddenly we can, manipulate this whole story in the
Well,
West, and it
just kill a
turns
few
into.
peacekeepers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the peacekeepers are killing the Ukrainians or something like that, and suddenly it becomes a huge thing. And again, this is far and away from the rest of the fighting that is going on. We're talking again about this tiny, look up Transnistria on a map. It is, I mean, microscopic in size. And again, no one will find this on a map. Most people probably don't even know that Moldova is a country, let alone that there's a pro-Russian breakaway state within it. So this is the perfect sort of area to kind of ramp things up. And again, there's not a whole lot that Russia can really do. As I said, this is far away from Russian territory. They've got a lot of other things going on. And the idea that this could turn into a real sort of shooting war is maybe not something that Putin is really, into at the moment. So this is again very interesting, and just to point out once more the importance of Odessa in the sort of overall conflict. Odessa was ground zero for one of the worst neo-Nazi attacks that happened since the Ukrainian war started, and this is when neo-Nazis, which are almost completely imported into Odessa, burned alive dozens of people in a trade union building, and this is still never been properly investigated. The Ukrainian government denies that they were Nazis, denies that this really ever took place like that. So Odessa is quite important, and to place Saakashvili there is, beyond insane. And it really does sort of strike you that this is where a proxy war would start. And
Wait,
again, it's
you had a funny video of Saakashvili making his first tour in Odessa with his new police chief today. We'll link this up in the show notes. It's
mm.
very funny.
Oh, absolutely. And just to point out again, Saakashvili doesn't even speak Ukrainian. He has like a rudimentary, grasp of the language. So this guy is being appointed to an extremely important governorship within this country, and he doesn't even speak the language. And again, what does this say about Saakashvili? I mean, his transparency is, going from, oh, I'm a Georgian, I'm going to return, to renouncing his citizenship and becoming, governor of a foreign country. I mean, how much could this guy really give a shit about the Georgian people? So something that we're definitely going to be keeping our eye on, and it is something that I think we can both agree on this, that this is a conflict that will turn into something in the near future. I'm pretty positive that Saakashvili is not going to just sit there hanging out in Odessa, taking kickbacks. I mean, I'm sure he'll be doing that, but he will begin meddling more and more what's going on in Transnistria. So I don't know, Christoph, do you have any other quick things you want to say about Saakashvili or Transnistria, anything like that?
No, I think we'll probably mention him in the next podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, for anyone that's, just tuning in for the first time, me and Christoph absolutely love Saakashvili. He's just continues to provide us with excellent stories to talk about. So, keep it up, Mikhail. Anyway, let's move on to another country that we speak about quite a bit on this, and that is Azerbaijan. And yet again, the unending political battle in Azerbaijan continues. The Azeri government is cracking down yet again on pro-Western forces. We've discussed several times on this podcast about the closing of RFERL's offices in Baku and the sort of tit for tat that's going on between Azerbaijan and the U.S. Now, this is nothing new, but recently the U.S. had to respond by holding off a, quote, democracy dialogue until it makes sense to do so. Now, I'm not really sure when that will be, if ever. It's not as if the government in Azerbaijan is really ever going to be ready, I think, for this type of, democracy that the West pretends to promote. But all the same, things have been escalating somewhat. Now, Azerbaijan knows not to go quite too far, and the U.S. seems okay with a lot of their actions up until a point. I would sort of posit that a lot of this back and forth fighting is sort of political theater. For Aliyev to maintain power within his power base, he has to at least give the perception that he is fighting against the NATO and the Western forces and those sort of organizations, much in the same way that Hamid Karzai would make a big stink about stuff, and then the CIA would give him bags of money, and then suddenly he would clam up about everything. But recently, there were some reports in the Azerbaijani media that the U.S. embassy was, in fact, funding opposition parties. Now, this should come as absolutely no surprise. That is what the U.S. embassy does pretty much everywhere it is. Now, this did get to a point, though, where the U.S. embassy had to officially deny that it was instructing or funding political parties. So, somewhat interesting, and again, sort of a little bit of a flare-up. But we wanted to talk about this because as we speak right now, the first ever European Games, the 2015 European Games, are underway. And what, better country to host the European Games than in the South Caucasus. So we have them going on right now in Baku. Now, the government has been warning of anti-Azerbaijani critics that they're going to be popping up, that the Azerbaijani people need to defend against this. Recently, Christoph, Germany's Olympic Committee in your home country has joined this anti-Azerbaijani group. Of course, it's still let all of their athletes go there and compete. So, again, sort of a hollow promise. And presidential advisor Ali Hassanov, who is known for not holding his tongue when he's in front of a camera, he's been praising the pro-government media and again imploring them to counteract any of this negative sort of press. And this reached a sort of a new level when Azerbaijan actually banned Amnesty International from attending the Euro Games, which is, sort of no big surprise. And Amnesty International is, of course, a pretty corrupt group, but all the same, that it is a very well-known organization, so that means a lot. This isn't like they're kicking out a small Western-funded NGO in Baku. They've also, and perhaps more importantly, told the Organization for Security and Cooperation, the OSCE, which is a European group, they've been told to halt all operations within 1 month, and they want them to leave. So, Christoph, I don't know, do you want to kind of expand on this in any way? I mean, and perhaps we can kind of discuss this in light of the FIFA investigations that have been going on. Of course, the spotlight is on Russia in these FIFA investigations. There's very little talking about Qatar and their obvious bribery to get the World Cup to travel to the hottest place on the planet in order to play. And no mention, of course, of the slave labor that Qatar is importing to build these massive stadiums. But it seems like now it's sort of, I don't know, Azerbaijan was attacked a little bit, but obviously the European Games are going on right now. So, I don't know, Christoph, you want to contextualize that for us at all?
Yes, the European Games are a huge deal for Azerbaijan, for the Aliyev regime. They have tried everything to make this success, and a few days ago they launched the Games with a lavish opening ceremony. The highlight was the performance of Lady Gaga, who was reportedly paid $2 million for singing a song,
Right.
and perhaps more importantly for diverting attention from the human rights situation in the country. There has been a lot of criticism in the run-up to the Games, not as much criticism as we have seen, for example, with the media campaign against Russia during the Sochi Olympics, but the Aliyev regime was definitely having a hard time promoting the Games in Europe. The unprecedented crackdown on journalists, activists, and NGOs and the like has really left its marks. And Baku's most recent action was to kick out the OSCE, which is, of course, also very interesting. The OSCE had dared to join the criticism in the run-up to the Games, and so it didn't take long before they were told to halt their operations and close their office within the next 4 weeks. So the OSCE joins a long list of Western-backed organizations which have recently been barred from Azerbaijan. I think we talked in a previous podcast about the crackdown on Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And then we had, of course, also Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the BBC, and The Guardian, who have also recently learned that the Aliyev regime can't deal with criticism. And Azerbaijan really spares neither trouble nor expense to make the games a success. And therefore, the absence of European leaders at the opening ceremony was a huge disappointment for Baku. Okay, the heads of Bulgaria, Luxembourg, Monaco, and San Marino were there, but that's not exactly what Azerbaijan had been hoping for. More noteworthy guests included Russian President Putin, Turkish President Erdogan, and Central Asian leaders. And this led one Azerbaijani journalist to suggest that the Europeans should stop playing with the Land of Fire if they don't want to miss out on the important energy deals which were discussed in Baku. And that's, of course, pretty ridiculous because projects like the Trans-Caspian pipeline or the Trans-Anatolian pipeline are either fully backed or even spearheaded by the EU. After all, the purpose of these southern gas corridor projects is to bring gas from the Caspian Sea to the EU. It's not like Azerbaijan could sell its gas to China instead. So Azerbaijan is not really in a position to pressure the EU. But it was very funny to see the back and forth in the media between Azerbaijan and the West. And probably the most important, most interesting news coming out from Baku was the meeting between Putin and Erdogan and the progress they made on the Turkish Stream project, which is Russia's new pipeline project. They apparently agreed on the route, and Gazprom sent the coordinates to Turkey and will probably start with the construction of the pipeline in the next couple of weeks. And the pipeline will run to a gas hub on the Turkish-Greek border. And here's where it gets very interesting, because Austrian newspaper Die Presse revealed a few days ago that Austria's energy giant OMV wants to revive the Nabucco project, but with Russian gas. And that's of course huge news, because Nabucco was designed to bypass Russia and Iran for that matter. But now OMV wants to bring Russian and Iranian gas to Europe with the new Nabucco project. So they're planning to build a pipeline from Austria to the gas hub on the Turkish-Greek border, linking the Turkish Stream pipeline with the new Russian Nabucco project. And Gazprom is super excited about this idea, and they've already met to discuss it. And now it's going to be interesting to see how the other EU countries on the Nabucco route react to this idea, and how also Azerbaijan reacts to this idea, because they have been left out, of course, of this project. And Azerbaijani gas is apparently not seen as the solution to reducing Europe's dependence on Russian gas. I think many people in Europe prefer to keep buying Russian gas instead of relying on Azerbaijan or Ukraine as a transit country. That's
well, absolutely. And I mean, we mentioned that a few months back on an episode when we were talking about the end of South Stream, that, you know, no matter how you look at it, Europe will continue to buy gas from Russia. There's just, you know, I mean, for all of the rhetoric coming from, you know, places like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, about how, oh, you know, Russia will have to start selling to China and other places. As you said, I mean, there are lots of European countries that would much prefer to deal with Russia than, say, Azerbaijan or other countries like that. And I just back quickly to the European games. I just find it so bizarre that this sort of campaign to turn Azerbaijan into some sort of European state. I mean, it clearly is not. It has very little in common with the culture of Europe. And, you know, it's so interesting. Amnesty International and all these other European groups, like, you know, the German Olympic Committee, all these things are, you know, complaining about the horrible human rights and whatnot. But no one seems to be asking, well, how did Baku get this? You know, talk about bribery. And more importantly, why is Baku even in the running for this? I mean, they're not. You know, there's nothing wrong with not being European, but it's just so bizarre, and that seems to be nowhere on the table. You know, Amnesty International will go on and on about the horrible human rights violations, and obviously that is going on right now. But they're not asking the question of why is Baku even hosting this. So very interesting, and again, it sort of you know, goes back to you know, this tit for tat attack between Azerbaijan in the West is so phony, because obviously Azerbaijan has no problem with hosting all of these European athletes and portraying themselves as a European nation, while at the same time, complaining about, Western-style democracy and things of that nature. But anyway, we'll be returning to this again, and I think particularly with these new pipeline developments, there's always something going on there. But perhaps now I think we're going to move on to our third story, and this is something that me and Christoph have been trying to include as much as possible, and that is the very real security collapse that is going on within Afghanistan. We've talked several times on the podcast about this, and I know we might sound like a broken record, but this is really a very important development, and in many ways will alter whatever sort of plans the deep state has for Central Asia. As I said, the deteriorating security situation continues to get worse, particularly in northern Afghanistan, which is an area that me and Christoph have talked about several times. We have places like Faryab province and several others on the borders with both Turkmenistan and Tajikistan. They've seen increased violence, increased activity from militants. We've even seen some of these Central Asian countries invading Afghanistan and setting up bases in order to crack down on this. Now, of course, we've also discussed how this is being hyped up, particularly by Russia and the Central Asian states, who are, of course, using this as a justification for any sort of crazy thing that they want to implement in their own country. So we've seen more draconian laws coming out of Central Asia. We've seen more bluster from Russia about the rise of ISIS in this whole region. But on the flip side of this, the West continues to either turn a blind eye or completely downplay this as any sort of problem. I just recently discovered a podcast called the Central Asianist Podcast, which is a podcast that a research fellow at Freedom House does. Full disclosure, he completely ripped off me and Christoph's idea, but that's fine. We're not going to get too angry at him. But he recently did a podcast talking about northern Afghanistan and Tajikistan, and it was interesting to see him talking to this expert, quote unquote, all about Tajikistan and the violence going on in northern Afghanistan. They're talking about the influx of fighters, the corruption, all these things, and then they sort of were like, "Yeah, but it's okay. It's not really a big deal, and no one should really be paying attention." So, the West sort of plays both sides of that whole thing. But just to give you an example of the problems that are going on, in May, the city of Kunduz was almost completely seized by the Taliban. There were reports that 2,000 families, somewhere in the neighborhood of 100,000 people, actually had to fled because of the fighting. And recently, the villages in Saripol, which are also in the north in the Badakhshan region, that entire village was seized by Taliban fighters. So again, this is a real thing, and it's interesting that this is happening in the north in the Badakhshan region, because this is a region that was fairly untouched by the entire Afghan war, but also by the Taliban. This was always seen as a region where the Taliban had little, if any, actual influence. Now, again, Afghan officials are continuing to criticize the central government in Kabul. Most recently, Atta Mohammed Noor, who is a powerful governor in the north, expressed his complete lack of faith in Ghani and basically called the government in Kabul a show. Even more recently, on June 6th, 300 Taliban fighters attacked and seized control of Yamgan district in Badakhshan province. Now again, Badakhshan borders Tajikistan, Pakistan, and perhaps most importantly, China as well. It borders Xinjiang. And now the Taliban, again, as I said, have never previously had control of this. So this is really becoming something that, again, is being downplayed entirely. CNN or Fox or any of those organizations, MSNBC, never seem to talk about this. So, Christoph, I don't know. Do you want to kind of expand on that at all, or maybe offer up your own ideas? I mean, I know it's difficult whenever we're talking about this region, and particularly in Afghanistan, but why don't you give us a little bit of your view on this?
Yes, the fighting in northern Afghanistan seems to be intensifying day by day. We have clashes in more and more northern provinces, with starting with Faryab, and then we had Badakhshan. Now we have also other northern Afghan provinces, Baghdi's, and keeps getting worse. And neighboring countries such as Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, are of course worried about the possibility of a spillover of violence from Afghanistan, and with good reason. The issue was also high on the agenda during recent meetings of both the Chinese-led Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Russian-led Collective Security Treaty Organization. And a few weeks ago in May, the CSTO even held drills on the Tajik-Afghan border, practicing how to repel a 700-man strong Taliban invasion of Tajikistan, which is a very, very unlikely scenario.
Yeah.
But small skirmishes on the border can happen at any time, as we have seen, for example, with the kidnapping of 4 Tajik border guards by the Taliban in December of last year. They were just released a few days ago after being held for several months, thanks to the help of Qatar, which raises the question what the Qatari regime gets in exchange from Tajikistan. I guess it won't be money. Perhaps they will get the permission to build a few more mosques. I don't know. But the violence in Afghanistan is a very important point, and we will probably keep coming back to this. And we've seen that Russia and China are keeping a very close eye on this, and are doing their best to really to end the conflict. Especially China has taken a major role in this, and has been doing quite a bit to restart the stalled Afghan peace talks in recent months. At the end of last month, the New York Times reported that Xinjiang's capital Urumqi hosted a meeting between a peace envoy from Afghanistan and Taliban officials with close links to Pakistani intelligence. And Afghanistan and Pakistan reportedly organized the meeting with the help and support of China. And that's something we've seen time and time again in recent months, that Beijing, after pressuring Pakistan into supporting the Afghan peace talks, has helped to organize a number of meetings where the 4 sides, the 4 parties, China, Pakistan, the Kabul government, and the Taliban, have come together in one form or another to talk about the situation in Afghanistan. And there are still a lot of differences even among the parties themselves. While one Taliban faction is in favor of peace talks, another faction wants to keep fighting, and the same is true of the government in Kabul, Pakistani intelligence, and so on. And to make matters worse, now there's another actor in Afghanistan, if you will, ISIS. So even if the Taliban agreed to strike a deal with Kabul, other groups such as ISIS would probably continue fighting. So the situation in Afghanistan is very complex, and it's very difficult to find a solution to the problems.
And this recent influx of ISIS fighters or ISIS defections from the Taliban to ISIS is, very interesting. The timing of this, of course, as China is pushing and is trying its best to negotiate some sort of a deal. Suddenly we have ISIS popping up out of nowhere. Of course, no one asking where they've come from, how they entered Afghanistan, where they're getting their money. There are, rumors floating around that they're trying, or that they have gained control of some of the poppy fields, and that this is how ISIS is funding what they're doing. That is entirely possible. I don't know how probable that really is.
But former President Hamid Karzai addressed this issue in a recent interview with Russia Today.
Yes, yeah.
And he pointed out that he said, if you ever hear in the coming months or years that ISIS is on the rise in Afghanistan and is expanding, it will mean that foreign forces are backing ISIS to destabilize Central Asia, and especially Russia and China. So he was clearly pointing towards the West.
Yeah. Oh, which is, rich coming from him, as he's obviously a complete puppet of the West. Of course, we'll say these things to Russia today now, when he's no longer in power and, isn't really accountable to anything. But just to sort of illustrate this point, just recently ISIS beheaded 10 Taliban fighters. And ISIS's actions are even extreme for the Taliban. The Taliban is always tried to portray itself as a regional group. They don't have plans for global domination, and they actually see ISIS as being too extreme even for them. So this is an interesting. And again, it's unclear what ISIS's agenda is for Afghanistan. Even in Syria and Iraq, there's some sort of semblance of what ISIS is trying to do. Whereas in Afghanistan, I mean, they seem to have popped up out of nowhere. They're gaining more and more fighters, either through defection or, I suppose, importing foreign fighters from elsewhere, probably Central Asia. But there's really no end game for them, it seems. Their only agenda right now seems to fight the Taliban and possibly to derail the peace talks that are going on. So, again, this is a complex topic and something that we're probably going to return to in some more detail as we start to get some more information about this. But
yes, I would add that recent developments suggest that ISIS could eventually even replace the Taliban as the most dominant militant group, as they have already done in Russia's North Caucasus, where the Caucasus Emirate is losing its supporters, and obviously in Syria. And ever since they gained a foothold in Afghanistan, they have tried to outstrip the Taliban. They are, for example, trying to exploit the fact that the Taliban leader Mullah Omar is nowhere to be seen.
Yes.
So they insult him frequently and promote their wannabe Caliph Baghdadi as the true leader of the jihadi world. And this has worked to some extent. Most ISIS fighters in Afghanistan are not from the Middle East, but have defected from the Taliban or other groups in Afghanistan. And I think therefore it was even more funny when recently the ISIS leader in Afghanistan, who is a former Guantanamo inmate, of course, as most ISIS leaders are, he tried to discredit Taliban by pointing out that they are working for Pakistani intelligence. I mean, come on, everyone knows that, and many of your fighters are former Taliban, so what's your point?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I saw that comment as well, and it was sort of like, but weren't you, weren't you fighting for ISI as well? And again, I mean, this sort of, revelation that the ISI is controlling the Taliban, I mean, this is nothing new. The Taliban wouldn't have had any weapons or support had the Pakistani ISI not given it to them in the 1980s. So, very, very bizarre comments. And again, I think, for a lot of people, the sort of foot soldiers, they may not really see necessarily the complexities of all of that. It's interesting you mentioned that the ISI is backing the Taliban, and all of the Taliban officials that were recently in Xinjiang for these negotiations actually do live in Pakistan. They don't live in Afghanistan anymore. So that kind of also adds another layer of difficulty to these negotiations because they're not actually there in Afghanistan. There's,
and now we have another player because Iran is apparently also stepping up its support of the Taliban. There was a recent report in the Wall Street Journal. I'm not sure if it's correct, but they said that Iran is stepping up its support and sending more cash and weapons to the Taliban to stop the rise of ISIS and to counter US influence in the region. And some have tried to dismiss the report as Western propaganda, but I think it makes perfect sense, and it wouldn't be the first time that Iran is supporting the Taliban.
No, absolutely not. And I think it's very easy to dismiss that as it's just propaganda from NATO or the West. But it does make sense. Again, Iran, one of the only countries actually fighting ISIS, they might see it as advantageous to fund the Taliban. And again, this is something that I'm beginning to sort of formulate more and more with ISIS is that, its whole goal is to basically make groups like the Taliban and Al Qaeda look sane. They're sort of like rehabilitating these violent jihadis all over the world as we're crazy and whatever, but wouldn't you prefer us to these other people? So again, very interesting that this is happening with the Taliban, which is for so long been seen as so horrible and evil, and it's it could be a possibility this is a way to sort of normalize the Taliban coming into some sort of power sharing role. That are they horrible? Yes, but them and Ghani are better than Baghdadi and God only knows who else. Again, very interesting, and we're going to keep, returning to this because Afghanistan is in many ways the sort of trigger for what is going on in the rest of Central Asia. It's important for a variety of geopolitical reasons, but much in the same way that the Congo is sort of a trigger for much of the violence that happens all over Africa, Afghanistan is in many ways a similar sort of analogy in Central Asia. But I think we'll sort of move on to our weird terrorism stories. Every month, me and Christoph try to pick some bizarre stories that happen in the milieu of the war on terror. And this month, we actually have two stories that we thought both of them deserve at least a quick mention here. And the first one is actually directly related in many ways to what's going on in Afghanistan. As we've mentioned on this podcast and on previous episodes, Tajikistan is quite nervous about what is going on in Afghanistan. Of all of the Central Asian nations, Tajikistan is probably the weakest in terms of security and military power. There's really not a whole lot going on in Tajikistan outside of it being a massive transshipment point for heroin. There's not oil or gas in any sort of way that places like Turkmenistan, let's say. It's not quite as strategically important as Kyrgyzstan. So Tajikistan is certainly, if you were to pick a Central Asian nation that could actually see something bad going on, that's the one that I would pick. And just recently, in mid-May, reports began circulating that a Tajik colonel by the name of Gulmurad Halimov, who either disappeared according to his family, on April 23rd, or according to his colleagues on May 6th. As I said, in late May, reports began circulating that Halimov had joined ISIS in Syria. Now, immediately his family denied this. They said that he, hated extremism and was never like that. Although a close friend said that he had become something of an ISIS fanatic. Now, this story became even more bizarre when Tajik law enforcement actually denied reports in Taj News, which is a Tajik news service, that Halimov had actually been arrested in Turkey while trying to enter Syria with a fake passport. And he was either being detained in Turkey or possibly extradited back to Tajikistan. Well, eventually Halimov did pop up, and it was in an ISIS video in which he claimed his complete allegiance to ISIS and to Baghdadi. And he pointed the blame at the Tajik government's crackdown on Islam, as well as the U.S. and also Russia, which is quite important. I think we'll get to that in a moment. But it should just be noted quickly that Halimov is not a low-level soldier who defected. He was the commander of the Tajik Interior Ministry Special Forces, which is known as Amkan or Aman. This is an elite police unit, and Christoph, well, why don't you get into this, because there's something also very interesting that should be noted, and that is the training that Halimov received in none other than the U.S. So I don't know, why don't you kind of elaborate on this story a little bit and offer up your own opinions on it?
Yes, he visited US, I don't know how many times, 4 times, 5 times,
I
something
believe
like
it's 5 times, yeah.
5 times, yes, was trained by Blackwater, among others. Yes, it's a crazy story. When this guy disappeared, his family immediately denied the reports that were coming out from Tajik media that he had joined ISIS. And this seemed also a bit unlikely because, after all, you wouldn't necessarily expect that a highly decorated and experienced police commander is susceptible to the laughable ISIS propaganda. And furthermore, he had a presumably well-paid job. And he had, of course, a family who insisted that he had never spoken about ISIS. But still, after a few weeks of confusing and conflicting reports, ISIS released their new propaganda video featuring Gulmurad Halimov, Tajikistan's former OMON commander. And in the video, Halimov showed off his skills, which he had acquired during anti-terrorism training in the US, and he made a few interesting comments, pointing out that he had joined ISIS in protest at Tajikistan's restrictions on practicing religion, which are getting more and more ridiculous lately, with fake permits for growing beards and wearing headscarves and things like that. And he also directed a couple of threats at the Tajik regime and the US and, of course, Russia. He said, for example, that Tajik labor migrants must stop serving infidels in Russia and join ISIS. So therefore, his appearance in the ISIS video sent shockwaves not only across Tajikistan, but also the rest of Central Asia and Russia. And it raises many questions. Why did he really join ISIS? I think it's hard to believe that he suddenly became an ISIS fanatic. And one Tajik police officer who knew him well emphasized that Halimov's decision must have been caused not by his religious viewpoints, but something else. And he didn't want to elaborate on this. I think money didn't play a role. So, yeah, it's really difficult to speculate why he did join ISIS. And he really came across as a fanatic in this ISIS video. So I don't know how he acted before that, and if there were any indications that he could be susceptible to ISIS propaganda. But it's a really crazy story, and it's very very concerning for the Tajik regime.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And again, we're sort of speculating here, but on why he might have joined. But this is, absolutely nothing new. This is a typical case of a tactic that the U.S. and the West has used over and over again. Most recently, this has become very fashionable in recent years in all over Africa. We had Colonel Sanogo, who overthrew Amadou Toumani Touré in Mali. And of course, just after that, suddenly Al-Qaeda was running amok all over Mali. And we also had, in neighboring Burkina Faso, we had Lieutenant Colonel Yakuba Isaac Zidia, who also sort of stepped in during a coup when Blaise Compaoré had to flee the country. And both of them were junior officers, and both of them received training in the United States. And then they were sort of quickly ousted. And of course, this is a long history. We had there's what's his name, the Chadian dictator Hissène Habré. He received a ton of training in the U.S. and perhaps maybe most famously Paul Kagame, the now leader of Rwanda, was famously in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, weeks before he left to return to Rwanda in 1990 to carry out, what would become the most probably horrific war crime in all of Africa, the genocide both in Rwanda, Burundi, and also in Congo. So this is a similar pattern that we see here. And of course, I was sort of struck at the similarities between Halimov and Omar al-Shishani, who, of course, was also trained by not in the United States, but was trained by Western forces, was part also of an elite group within Georgia, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, converts to Islam and decides that he's a radical Muslim fanatic and, pops up in the Caucasus and then pops up in Syria. So, yeah, it's troubling. But it does seem to fit into a sort of pattern here. So I think we're going to see this Halimov character popping up again and again. Of course, it's great propaganda value for ISIS. He talked about how he saw, that Muslim soldiers were treated worse than regular soldiers. And it's also great, for the West as well. It's a great new enemy for us, and we helped him, and look what he did. So, it'll be very interesting. And of course, it's not clear at all what sort of training Halimov really received. Presumably he was part of the interior police force, so it had something to do with policing, but God only knows. Obviously, people like Paul Kagame were basically trained in how to carry out a genocide and how to work with the CIA when he was there. So God only knows what Halimov was taught. And again, could this have been, prearranged? It seems entirely likely. And again, of course, Tajikistan is using this to, as you said, to crack down in even more bizarre ways. And I just saw two things that popped into my mind, popped up recently. One is this ban where they're considering to ban names that sound too Arabic. And also, we had a presenter on state television saying that women who wear hijabs are prostitutes. So Tajikistan is maybe not quite, handling this in the best way. But an even stranger terrorism story, and again, sort of related in with all of this sort of stuff going on. We had a recent trial in London against Swedish national Berlin Gildo. Had to be stopped, and the case was thrown out when it became very clear that MI6 and the British government were in fact supporting and arming the same group that Gildo was fighting with. Now, reporting on this is somewhat vague, and there's no direct mention of exactly what group Gildo was with that was receiving MI6 money and arms. There's nothing really, to the pointing out, if it was this group or that group. All we do know is that MI6 was funding and arming several groups during this time when Gildo was over there, including the FSA, and that Gildo was allegedly receiving training and fighting alongside al-Nusra. So perhaps MI6 was funding al-Nusra. I wouldn't be surprised. But Christoph, do you have anything else on this, or you want to just throw out your opinion? This one just struck me as completely insane because again, this is just like a public admission that MI6 is funding the very same groups that they're trying to put people away for fighting with.
Yes, crazy story, and there was very few reporting on it in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
RT UK picked it up and made a short video about it, which was very funny. And then, of course, this report in the Guardian, and that's the story I've been waiting for since the start of the conflict in Syria. Brilliant. And I wonder why it took them so long to use this defense in court. I would use exactly the same argument. Even if you can't get them to adopt a case, you can at least embarrass them by pointing out the obvious hypocrisy. I mean, it keeps getting more and more grotesque. And now we've reached a point where they have difficulties prosecuting terrorists at home because they are supporting the same people abroad. And that's just insane.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, if you haven't seen this story, I definitely encourage you to check it out. As I said, though, I mean, there's not a lot of details. Obviously, MI6 doesn't want to name the group that they were funding or really get into anything. But yeah, I mean, the case was completely shut down basically when this was discovered. So I think maybe we'll wrap it up there. I will say though that me and Christoph and most likely James Corbett will be discussing these issues and particularly some of these stories about Halimov, about this Swedish national, and some of the sort of evolution of ISIS on a brand new Boiling Frogs Post roundtable. So I hope that the listeners are already subscribed to Boiling Frogs Post, and if you're not, then certainly do subscribe to it because we're going to get into a lot more detail about these particular stories and also about the sort of evolution, what's going on. But anyway, I think we're going to wrap it up there. Of course, if you want to, download this episode, if you want to listen to more, then please do visit PorkinsPolicyReview.com. And of course, Christoph, there's always a million other stories that we don't get to cover on the podcast. We only do it once a month. There were some interesting things, another Kadyrov scandal going on, a whole bunch of stuff going on in Georgia, in the Caucasus, and with Omar al-Shishani. So, Christoph, if the listeners want to read more about this, then of course I would implore them to go to your blog. And please, tell everybody your blog and where they can find your work and the New Great Game Roundup.
Of course, you can find my blog at christophgerman.blogspot.com, and of course, all my roundups are on Boiling Frogs Post, and you can find also my other work on Russia Insider.
Well, excellent. And again, if you want to ask me and Christoph any questions, if you have some topics that you'd like us to cover, then you can definitely tweet both of us. You can tweet me at Porkins Policy, and of course, you can tweet Christoph at New Great Game. Well, as I said, we're going to leave it there. We'll be coming back to you in just about a month with a whole bunch more crazy, interesting stories about this sort of evolving, ever-changing landscape in Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the global war on terror. So, Christoph, thank you so much.
Thanks, Piers.
Friday's flow, a grandmaster flash. I'm the black cat on the jam. A rock sweet. Come on. On the telephone, boy, I want to take you home. Relax your mind to the funky beat. Say hit me, come on now. Calling Mr. Telephone, I say, I'm calling Mr. Telephone. I say, rock this beat to the funky beat. I say, rock this beat to the funky beat. Calling Mr. Telephone, I say, I'm calling Mr. Telephone. I said, ding dong, I said, ding dong. I said, a ding a ding a ding a dong dong. I said, tried to take you by the hand, but you didn't understand what I'm talking about. Come on now, ha ha ha. A funky rap is touched by the breaker rock beat. Try to understand why it's happening in the